It was an ordinary evening at one of Beverly Hills' most luxurious restaurants. The chandeliers sparkled, glasses clinked, and the soft murmur of wealthy conversations filled the air. Guests dressed in designer suits and gowns laughed over expensive wine, each of them basking in the comfort of luxury. But then, the door opened. In walked a man who looked nothing like the rest. His clothes were simple, even wrinkled. His hair was slightly unkempt, and his shoes looked worn from walking. At first glance, he could have been mistaken for someone who didn't belong there at all. This man was Keanu Reeves, but almost no one recognized him that night. The waiter at the front desk glanced at him from head to toe, then smirked with thinly veiled disdain. "Good evening," he said with sarcasm dripping from his tone. "Are you sure you're in the right place? This restaurant is quite expensive." A few nearby guests heard the remark and chuckled quietly, whispering to each other. To them, it was entertainment. Someone who clearly didn't fit into their perfect picture of luxury, daring to step into their world. Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't frown. He didn't even correct the waiter. Instead, he gave a polite nod, his calm eyes betraying no anger, no embarrassment, almost as if he had expected this reaction all along. The waiter raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. To him, this was just another nobody trying to enjoy a life that wasn't his. So with a dismissive gesture, he picked up a menu and said, "Very well, follow me. But I hope you don't mind a seat that's more suitable for you." The waiter led Keanu past the golden chandeliers, past the tables where the city's elite dined, all the way to the very back, beside the kitchen doors. The loud clatter of dishes and shouts of chefs spilled out every time the doors swung open. It was the worst seat in the entire restaurant, and yet Keanu sat down without complaint. He simply adjusted his chair, placed the napkin on his lap, and looked around the restaurant with the same calm, almost amused smile. No one could have guessed that the man they were mocking would soon leave every single person in that room stunned into silence, because this wasn't just a stranger who had wandered in. This was Keanu Reeves, an icon, a legend, and a man who carried a truth they would soon regret discovering. The waiter's footsteps echoed across the marble floor as he led Keanu through the glittering dining hall. Chandeliers dripped golden light onto tables covered with silk-white linens, where the city's wealthy elite laughed over champagne. Yet the waiter made no attempt to offer Keanu such elegance. Instead, he marched him past every prime table, past every sparkling smile, all the way to the very back of the restaurant, beside the swinging doors of the kitchen. Each time the doors burst open, a harsh clang of dishes and the sharp voices of chefs spilled out, breaking the refined atmosphere of the dining room. The smell of smoke and frying oil mixed with the expensive perfume of the guests nearby. It was the one table no paying customer ever wanted. The waiter stopped there and tapped the edge of the chair with a smug grin. "Here you are, sir. I trust this will be comfortable." A few guests turned their heads to watch. A couple of them shook their heads, whispering to each other, as if amused by the little drama unfolding before their eyes. Keanu sat down without hesitation. His face remained calm, his smile almost gentle. He unfolded the napkin and placed it neatly across his lap, as though he were seated in the grandest corner of the hall. The waiter, unsatisfied with this lack of reaction, leaned forward and handed him the menu with deliberate slowness. "I must warn you," he said, voice dripping with sarcasm, "our dishes are not exactly cheap." Keanu glanced at the menu, his calm eyes scanning the options. Then, without hesitation, he looked up and said softly, "I'll have the chef's special, and a glass of your finest wine." The waiter froze for a moment. The chef's special wasn't just expensive, it was the most expensive dish on the menu. A single serving cost more than what many people earned in a week. The glass of wine alone could have been the price of an entire dinner elsewhere. Suppressing a laugh, the waiter scribbled on his notepad and muttered under his breath, just loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "Of course, if you can pay for it." Several guests exchanged looks. Some smirked, others frowned in quiet disapproval. A young couple whispered to each other, their eyes fixed on Keanu, curious about how he would react. But Keanu didn't react. He simply nodded, thanked the waiter with a polite "I'll wait," and leaned back in his chair with that same calm, unshaken smile. The waiter clicked his tongue, irritated that his mockery had no effect. He walked away with exaggerated confidence, as though certain that this nobody was making a fool of himself. At the corner table, Keanu sat silently. He was in no hurry, no agitation. His posture carried a quiet strength that no insult could touch. Little did the waiter know, every step he took toward humiliating this man was only leading him closer to a moment he would regret for the rest of his life. The order had been placed, but the waiter had no intention of serving quickly. Instead, he chose to test his guest's patience, making Keanu wait longer than anyone else in the restaurant. Minutes stretched into half an hour, the clinking of silverware, the laughter of nearby guests, the aroma of fresh dishes being delivered to other tables. Keanu witnessed it all, as plate after plate bypassed him and went elsewhere. From his corner seat, the insult was clear. He was not a priority. He was not respected. He was not wanted there, and yet he did not complain. Keanu sat calmly, sipping the glass of water that had been poured without care. His posture remained straight, his eyes observant, and that quiet, unshaken smile still lingered on his face. The waiter passed by several times, each time smirking as if expecting irritation, a raised voice, or perhaps even the humiliation of the man standing up and leaving. But no such moment came. Nearby, an elderly man, seated with his wife, noticed everything. He leaned forward, whispering to her, "They're treating him unfairly. Look at the way that waiter behaves." The woman nodded softly. "Yes, but he seems so calm, almost as if he doesn't mind." Across the room, a young couple also observed. They had noticed the dismissive seating, the sarcasm, the mocking comments. While others giggled or ignored the scene, this couple remained silent, eyes fixed on the mysterious guest who bore the insults without a word. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the waiter returned with a small appetizer. He set the plate down carelessly, the silverware clattering against the table. "There you are," he said with a smirk. "I do hope this is enough for you." His voice carried just loud enough for nearby tables to hear. A few people exchanged looks, some amused, others uncomfortable. Keanu thanked him with a calm nod and began to eat slowly, savoring each bite as though it were the finest dish he had ever tasted. His composure was unsettling, almost irritating to the waiter, who expected anger but received serenity instead. The waiter leaned closer, his voice dripping with mockery. "You know, people like you rarely stay until dessert. They usually realize this place is far beyond their means." For the first time, Keanu looked directly into his eyes. His expression was still calm, his voice still gentle as he replied, "Is that what you believe?" The waiter blinked, caught off guard for a second. There was something about the tone, quiet but carrying weight, as though beneath the calm surface rested an ocean of unshakable strength. But before he could respond, Keanu returned to his meal, unbothered, as though the insult had never been spoken. The silence that followed was heavy. The elderly man frowned, shaking his head in disapproval. The young couple leaned closer to each other, whispering, "Why is he not saying anything? Why is he just smiling?" Because that smile, it wasn't weakness, it wasn't ignorance, it was something else. Something they couldn't quite name. Every insult the waiter delivered, every delay in service, every mocking glance, it was like pushing against a wall that refused to move. And the more the waiter tried, the more foolish he began to look, not his guest. The pressure in the room grew thicker with each passing moment. Guests who had once laughed now grew silent, curious, even uncomfortable. The calmness of this quiet man was beginning to feel like a storm waiting to break, and soon it would. The restaurant buzzed with laughter, the sound of clinking glasses, and the aroma of fine cuisine. But at one corner, an uncomfortable drama was unfolding, one that many had started to notice. The waiter, unsatisfied with Keanu's silence, had grown bolder. Every trip to the corner table became another opportunity to throw in a comment, a smirk, a jab meant to remind him that he didn't belong. By now, whispers had begun to ripple across the dining hall. The elderly couple who had been watching shook their heads in quiet disapproval, while the young pair across the room leaned forward, almost holding their breath, curious about how long this strange man's patience would last. The waiter returned again, balancing a tray with exaggerated care. He set down Keanu's main dish with a loud clatter, causing forks at nearby tables to pause mid-air. "There we go," the waiter announced, voice raised louder than necessary. "The chef's special, a fine dish, usually enjoyed by people who can actually afford it." A ripple of laughter escaped from a table nearby. Not everyone laughed. Some gasped softly, others frowned, but the damage was done. The insult wasn't subtle anymore. It was public. The waiter straightened, folding his arms as he looked down at Keanu, his smirk widening as if to say, "Now, let's see you crumble." But Keanu didn't crumble. He adjusted his chair, unfolded his cutlery, and began eating with the same quiet grace as before, savoring each bite as though none of the words had ever reached him. This silence infuriated the waiter. His smirk faltered for just a second. He wanted a reaction, anger, embarrassment, anything. But all he received was calm, so he decided to push harder. Stepping back just enough for everyone to hear, he spoke again. "You know," his voice dripped with mockery, "this restaurant prides itself on exclusivity. It's not the kind of place for just anyone who walks in off the street." The words hung in the air like a blade. The room grew still. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Forks froze over plates. Even the music in the background seemed distant now. All eyes turned toward the corner table. For the first time that evening, Keanu lifted his head. His eyes, calm yet piercing, met the waiter's. The room held its breath, and then, in voice low but carrying to every corner of the hall, he asked, "Not for everyone, or just not for people you choose to look down on?" The question cut through the silence like thunder. The waiter blinked, caught off guard, his smugness faltering. The elderly man at the corner murmured, "Good for him," while his wife nodded firmly. The young couple leaned back, eyes wide, as though they had just witnessed the beginning of something no one had expected. Keanu didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words, though soft, carried more weight than any insult could. His calm tone wasn't just a defense. It was a mirror, forcing the waiter's arrogance back onto himself. The silence stretched. No one moved. Every guest in the room was watching, waiting, sensing that this was no ordinary moment. The waiter opened his mouth, perhaps to retort, but no words came. He swallowed hard, the smirk vanishing from his face, and then footsteps echoed across the hall. The manager had arrived, walking briskly toward the scene, his face pale, his eyes widening the moment they fell on the man seated calmly at the corner table. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Something was about to break, something none of them had expected, because the man they thought was nobody was about to reveal an identity that would turn humiliation into regret. The entire restaurant seemed to freeze the moment the manager appeared. His polished shoes tapped against the marble floor, echoing louder than the background music, louder than the faint clinking of glasses that had stopped mid-air. Every eye in the room followed him as he cut across the dining hall. His expression tight, his movements quick but precise. The tension was suffocating. Patrons leaned forward in their seats, sensing that something extraordinary was about to happen. At the corner table, Keanu Reeves remained seated, calm and composed, his hands resting lightly on the table as though the chaos swirling around him did not exist. His presence, so serene, was in stark contrast to the storm of whispers that buzzed across the room. The waiter's smirk, once wide and arrogant, was now uncertain. His confidence wavered as the manager drew closer. He shifted his weight nervously, glancing from Keanu to the other diners and back again. Something was wrong, something he hadn't expected. The manager finally stopped at Keanu's table. For a heartbeat, he simply stared, and then his face changed. His eyes widened with recognition, and a wave of shock washed over his features before transforming into respect, deep, unmistakable respect. "Mr. Reeves," the manager exclaimed, his voice trembling with urgency, yet layered with reverence. I wasn't informed you would be visiting us tonight. It is an absolute honor to have you here." The words rang through the dining hall like a thunderclap. Gasps spread across the restaurant. Diners who had whispered their doubts, who had judged silently from their seats, now leaned back in stunned silence. The man in the simple jacket, the one who had been mocked, humiliated, treated as less than, was none other than Keanu Reeves, the world-renowned actor, philanthropist, and, as the manager quickly revealed, one of the very investors behind this very restaurant. The waiter froze, his face draining of color. His mouth opened as though to speak, but no words came out. He looked as if the ground beneath him had vanished. Keanu, however, did not move. He simply looked at the manager, his expression unreadable, before finally speaking in the same calm, measured tone that had carried him through the entire evening. "Thank you," he said softly, "but there's no need for apologies on my behalf. What matters is how we treat people." The manager's face hardened. He turned sharply toward the waiter, his voice now low but cutting. "Ashley," he said, the waiter's name spilling into the air like an accusation. "What have you done?" The waiter stammered. I didn't know, sir." I didn't realize who he was. You thought what?" The manager interrupted, his tone sharp enough to silence even the nearby diners. "That a guest who dresses simply is less worthy of respect? That you could humiliate someone publicly in this establishment?" The waiter swallowed hard, eyes darting desperately around the room, but there was no escape. Everyone was watching. The couple who had been whispering earlier now stared openly, their faces filled with disapproval. The elderly man at the corner gave a slow shake of his head. Even the pianist, hands hovering above the keys, had stopped playing to witness the scene unfold. Keanu raised his hand gently, and the manager fell silent. For a moment, the restaurant was still again. Then Keanu spoke, not with anger, not with pride, but with a calm authority that carried to every corner of the room. "There should be no need to state who I am to be treated with dignity," he said. "It should not matter if I wear a tailored suit or worn-out shoes. Every person who walks through these doors deserves respect. Every single one." The words resonated deeply, not just with the staff, but with the guests as well. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, reflecting on how they themselves had laughed earlier. Others nodded slowly, visibly moved by the truth in his statement. The manager bowed his head. "You're right, Mr. Reeves. I can assure you this will be addressed immediately." But Keanu wasn't finished. He turned his gaze back to the waiter, whose eyes brimmed with panic. Yet Keanu's expression was not one of cruelty. It was steady, even compassionate, though firm. "This isn't about me," Keanu continued. "It's about what we choose to see when we look at others. Do we see value, or do we see only what fits our expectations?" The waiter's eyes glistened. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by something raw, fear, regret, and perhaps the first flicker of understanding. Around the room, the silence was heavy but charged. Patrons looked at each other, some nodding, others lowering their eyes. A lesson was unfolding before them. Not a scene of celebrity ego, but of humility, respect, and humanity. Finally, Keanu leaned back, his voice softening, but still carrying weight. "I don't want special treatment," he said. "I want equality. And if we can't offer that here, then this restaurant loses its true value." The manager placed a hand over his chest, his face red with shame. "Understood, sir. From this moment on, things will change." At that, Keanu simply offered a faint smile, the same quiet smile he had worn all evening. But now, it carried the weight of revelation. For the guests, the message was unforgettable. For the waiter, it was devastating. And for the restaurant, it was transformative. The man mocked for looking ordinary had reminded everyone that dignity is the most extraordinary quality of all. The restaurant remained silent long after Keanu's words faded into the air. It was as though time itself had paused, every person in the room reflecting on what had just unfolded before their eyes. The once arrogant waiter stood motionless, his face pale, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. The smirk that had carried him all evening was gone, replaced by something no one expected: shame. He swallowed hard and finally spoke, his voice trembling. "Mr. Reeves, I'm sorry, truly, I didn't realize what I was doing." But Keanu's eyes didn't hold anger. They held something heavier, disappointment mixed with compassion. He leaned forward slightly, his tone calm but unshakably firm. "You didn't need to realize who I was," he said. "You only needed to realize who you are when you choose to treat someone this way." The words cut deeper than any reprimand. They weren't about fame or money or status. They were about humanity, the kind that transcends everything else. The waiter lowered his gaze, his shoulders trembling. For the first time, he looked smaller, not because Keanu had diminished him, but because the weight of his own actions had finally sunk in. At another table, the elderly man who had been watching all along whispered to his wife, "That's a lesson he'll never forget." She nodded, wiping at her eyes. Across the room, the young couple exchanged a look, half awe, half guilt. They had laughed earlier at the waiter's jokes, had joined in the mockery without realizing what it meant. Now they sat quietly, wishing they could take back every chuckle, every glance. The manager, still standing beside Keanu, looked at the guests one by one. His voice carried an unusual softness, as if Keanu's words had struck him too. "Tonight, we've all been reminded of something important," he said. "This restaurant was built to celebrate people, not to judge them. That must never be forgotten again." The pianist, who had long abandoned his keys, let his hands fall gently onto the instrument. A soft, thoughtful melody began to drift across the hall, low, reflective, as though echoing the mood of the moment. Keanu finally stood. The room seemed to rise with him, not physically but in spirit. He wasn't just taller in that moment. He was larger, a quiet force that filled the space with dignity. He placed his napkin gently on the table, then looked around the restaurant. His eyes weren't cold or prideful. They were warm, tired, yet deeply human. "I've lived long enough to know," he said softly, "that respect costs nothing, yet it gives everything. The way you treat someone may not change the world, but it will change their world. Never forget that." The words fell into the silence like pebbles into a still pond, rippling outward, touching everyone in the room. One by one, diners lowered their heads, some in shame, some in gratitude. The lesson wasn't just for the waiter, it was for all of them. The waiter's eyes glistened now, not from fear, but from regret. He whispered, "I'll do better." His voice cracked, barely audible, but in the stillness of the room, everyone heard it. Keanu gave the faintest of nods, then turned toward the exit. No entourage, no spectacle, just a man in a simple jacket walking out the same way he had walked in. But this time, the silence he left behind wasn't of mockery or doubt. It was of reflection, of respect. As the doors closed softly behind him, the restaurant seemed changed. Conversations resumed, but more quietly, thoughtfully. The young couple leaned into each other, speaking in hushed tones. The elderly woman dabbed her eyes with a napkin. Even the staff moved with a new kind of reverence, as if the very walls had absorbed the weight of what had happened. The manager called the waiter aside. His tone was stern but not cruel. "You've been given a chance most never get to learn your lesson, not from punishment but from wisdom. Don't waste it." The waiter nodded, his face flushed with humility. For the first time that evening, he understood the value of his role, not as someone who served dishes, but as someone who could serve people. Outside, the city lights glimmered as Keanu stepped into the night, blending with the crowd, unnoticed once again. And yet, inside that restaurant, his presence remained, a silent echo that would not fade, because what had happened wasn't about a celebrity. It wasn't about wealth or fame. It was about something deeper. It was about the quiet reminder that dignity is the greatest gift we can give another human being. And long after the laughter had died, long after the glasses had been cleared, the people who had been there that night would carry the memory with them, not of a waiter's mockery, not of a manager's scolding, but of a man who walked in as nobody and walked out, having reminded them what it truly means to be somebody.